Hi, I want to talk to you today about moral conflicts. On almost every moral theory, there can be moral conflicts, and Jeremy Bentham claims it is a great advantage to his version of utilitarianism that it gives you a way of resolving moral conflicts. Whether you think he's right about that or not, I do think the focus on moral conflicts is important. Moral conflicts are ubiquitous. They're all over the place in everyday life, in professional life, in many different contexts. There are extreme situations like wars or epidemics where one can constantly face really difficult moral choices. But even in an ordinary setting, without any crisis at hand, it can happen easily enough. People come into conflict with each other, but moral principles can come into conflict with each other too. So all of us can end up in a situation where we face a moral conflict. It would seem as if one of the most important tasks of a moral theory is to help us deal with the moral conflicts. Most of us have some understanding of what right and wrong are, what common sense moral rules are that we ought to live by. The hard questions come when those things come into conflict. And one of the dismaying things about much of traditional ethics is that when you come to those hard cases, it gives up. It simply says, well, yeah, you face a conflict. And we need to know what to do in those cases. Well, in this video, I'm not going to explain what I think you ought to do in those cases, so I'm not going to give you a solution either. But I am going to give you a range of traditional moral dilemmas that arise in the literature, many of them from the medieval literature that's often ignored. But I think it's really good to have your head full of cases like this so you're aware of the range and complexity of moral conflicts and can appreciate and then evaluate various moral theories on the basis of how well they help you understand these kinds of moral conflicts. Sometimes you may get a solution. Sometimes you may conclude, I don't see what the solution is, but at least I can identify the dimensions of the problem. So let's turn to some of these moral conflicts. In all of these cases, there is a kind of trade-off that has to be made. There are different moral values at stake, and Bentham argues that utilitarianism is a method, and the best method for resolving these conflicts, for making the trade-offs. But does it do it in the right way? We're going to look a little bit later at a series of cases and dilemmas that people have proposed as arguing against utilitarianism and think about whether the utilitarian has a good reply. But here I want to just talk about some cases that haven't been proposed for that kind of specific purpose, but instead seem to me interesting test cases for utilitarianism or for any moral theory. In general, you ought to have a theory that tells you something about what you do in cases like these. Here's the first one. I'll call it the returning arms dilemma. It arises in Plato's Republic. He's considering a definition of justice, and he proposes this as a counterexample that tries to show that's not an adequate understanding of justice. Suppose that a friend, when in his right mind, has deposited arms with me, and he asks for them when he's not in his right mind. Ought I to give them back to him? Well, it's easy to see what the dilemma is here. I had promised to return these things, like that sharp knife when he came back and needed it. But it turns out now he's not in his right mind. He's intent on committing mayhem. He's going to commit a murder with this. And I think, well, I don't want to, look, a life is at stake here. I don't think I should give him back the knife, but I promised to give it back when he asked for it, and he's asking for it, so what do? I face a conflict between my principle that says I should keep my promises, give him back the knife, but also my sense that, look, I'm putting another human being in great danger here if I give him back this knife. I shouldn't do it. And of course, I'm not only putting somebody in danger, this guy is not rational. It's not as if he's making a choice about doing harm because he thinks that's the right thing to do in a rational frame of mind. He's really furious, and I don't trust him to be rational at all. So what should I do? This is a case, by the way, where Plato thinks there's an easy answer. Don't give him the knife back. And most people would agree. But notice it really is a moral conflict case, and you had better have a theory that explains how we can make that kind of judgment relatively quickly. Bentham says no problem. We think about a promise versus endangering a life. We think, yeah, forget the promise. It's not that important. You can say, oh man, I can't find the knife. I'll get it back to you tomorrow or something. And look, that's fine. I mean, that's way better in its consequences than giving him back the knife and having him commit a murder with it. Here's another dilemma. This is one we've encountered before in Confucius. It's the stealing a sheep dilemma. The Duke of She told Confucius, "Some of us are upright. If our father had stolen a sheep, we'd bear witness to it." Confucius said, "In my country, the people are different. The son conceals the misdeeds of the father, and the father conceals the misdeeds of the son. Uprightness is to be found in this." There is a hard question there and a real dilemma between your family obligation and your obligation to the greater society. A wrong has been committed, an injustice has been committed. One of those common sense moral rules that W.D. Ross talks about is promote justice. Well, that would seem to involve doing something about this theft of a sheep. But on the other hand, honor thy father and thy mother. It looks like you have an obligation to your parents that is also very real. So what should you do? Confucius is saying here the family obligation takes precedence. Well, stealing a sheep isn't maybe that serious. Does it always take precedence, even if he's right about this one? Hard to say. Here is Euthyphro's dilemma from one of Plato's dialogues, the Euthyphro. Euthyphro is prosecuting his own father. He says, "My father and family are angry with me for taking the part of the murderer and prosecuting my father. They say that he did not kill him." There was someone who was working for the father, and he was accused of killing someone, that worker, and so the father threw him in a deep ditch while he went off to get the authorities. While in the ditch, the man died of exposure because the father was delayed in returning. And so the son is prosecuting the father for murdering the accused murderer who he threw in the ditch and then who died of exposure. Anyway, they said, I shouldn't take any notice because it's my father. Surely his son is doing wrong who prosecutes his father. They say, but I think, no, I think my father was responsible for this man's death and I have to testify against him. Well, again, there's a real dilemma here, basically the same dilemma as in Confucius's case, potential wrongdoing by the father, and so the family obligation comes into conflict with this desire to promote justice. But in this case, it's a lot more serious than stealing a sheep. Now notice it's still a complicated and ambiguous case. The father isn't clearly a murderer. He was doing this because this guy was accused of murder and he wanted him to stay there. He had no way of confining him or bringing him along. And so it was like, well, if I just leave and go get the authorities, it's going to take me a while to do that. And so, I mean, we're talking days. We're talking about ancient China here. We're not talking about, I have to drive down to town or something. And so it's like, but he's going to get away. Well, I better confine him in such a way he can't get away. I'll put him in this pit that he can't climb out of. But then, and I'll be back in plenty of time. He'll be all right. But then I'm delayed. I can't get back in time. Anyway, it's a kind of ambiguous situation. But what if it's not? What if the father really is a murderer and really did kill someone? And then what if it's something even worse than that? Mass murder and so on. So we can keep going on with this. Like at some point, don't we draw the line and push it further? However you think it might be with a very minor offense or an extremely serious offense, there are going to be cases in the middle where this is a hard choice. And so we need to think about that full range of cases. Here's a different kind of case. The hiding fugitive dilemma. Suppose a man should take refuge with you who by your lie might be saved from death. Wouldn't you tell it? So here's the picture. The axe murderer. Jack Nicholson is here at the door with the axe. Is Joey inside? Well, Joey is inside. He came in and you promised to hide him. And so he's hiding in the back closet. But now you've been asked a question. How should you respond? Well, there is a moral rule that says you should tell the truth. You should be honest. But on the other hand, if you say, oh yeah, Joey's in the back closet, I've seen him, Joey's going to die. This guy's going to kill him with the axe. So it looks like, okay, I can either tell the truth or I can save my friend's life. I can't do both. If I tell the truth, my friend's going to die. So what do I do? Should I tell the lie? Well, most of us would say, yeah, your friend's life is worth telling a lie. Tell the lie. It's not that hard a dilemma. The same question arises for Immanuel Kant much later, and we'll talk about it in connection with Kant's theory, where Benjamin Constant, a French philosopher, asks Kant the same question and writes a little piece saying, Kant says one of the things that follows from his theory is that you should never tell a lie. Really? You should never tell a lie? And he gives him his variant on Augustine's case here, saying, really, what if there's a murderer at the door and you're protecting a friend? Are you really going to save a life and tell a lie, as I think you should? Or are you going to follow your own theory and say, I cannot tell a lie, my friend is in the back closet, and watch him get murdered? Well, Augustine and Kant say you have to tell the truth. They say, even if your friend gets murdered, your obligation is to tell the truth. And so that's a harsh thing to think. Most of us don't think that. And it's a shocking thing to think. Why does Kant say, how does Kant defend that? Well, Kant says, just say it loudly so your friend can hear and can get out of the closet and can escape. Maybe that'll happen. And maybe the guy won't really kill him. Or maybe he would have killed him anyway. So you really don't know what the consequences are. Now, to some extent, we can say, well, that's lame. That's not much of a response. But on the other hand, there is a serious point behind what Kant is arguing. Don't be so sure you understand the consequences of your action. The consequentialist says, think about what will work out best in this situation. But Kant's saying, do you really know what the consequences are going to be? Maybe you can make some judgment about general tendencies. But look, we're talking about a particular case here. And you don't know what's going to happen if you do or do not tell the truth, if you do or do not open that door to the murderer. And so, yeah, you're guessing. And maybe you're guessing right about the consequences. Maybe you're guessing wrong. Maybe there are other things you can do to try to prevent those consequences from happening. In any case, he thinks there's a kind of hubris involved in the in the consequentialist position, which is simply to say, yeah, I can judge the tendencies of action, and this is better. Kant says, don't be so sure you can judge the effects of this particular action especially. But even actions of this kind, how much of experience have you had lying to murderers to save the life of a friend? This is a very specific kind of action. You haven't had any relevant experience here. So even if you say, hey, I'm looking at the general tendencies, come on, man, this is not something it's easy to have any general impression of. It's a rare and difficult situation. And that's going to be the case with many of these situations where we face a moral conflict. There's something pretty specific and pretty unique about that. Don't think that your general impressions of kinds of action and tendencies based on your general knowledge of the world is going to help you here. This is a really special kind of situation. Even if it's not absolutely unique, it's of a highly specific kind. You're going to have trouble coming up with any reasonable justification for thinking those are the consequences, and that's the judgment you ought to make. Here's another dilemma, the poor parent's dilemma. It comes from William of Auxerre and Alexander of Hales, though it's been repeated more famously on the contemporary scene by Jean-Paul Sartre. Here is the classic version for medieval philosophy. Somebody whose parents are poor promises to enter a monastery. He becomes convinced, filled with religious fervor, convinced that this is his obligation. But in a sense, it doesn't matter whether it's to enter a monastery or to do whatever. The point is to travel far from the parents. If he keeps his promise, he abandons his parents, who depend on him for support. If he doesn't, he breaks his vow. And so there's, again, this family obligation in this case to not only take care of your parents, but to fulfill a promise that you would take care of your parents. But on the other hand, some other moral consideration. Maybe a vow, like a promise to join a monastery or to take a job in another city. Maybe it's simply the sense that, look, I can do a lot of good if I go somewhere else. And that brings us to Jean-Paul Sartre's variant on this. He's talking about a real student of his. And he says, this student came to me with this moral dilemma. It was during the Second World War. France had been taken over by the Nazis, and he felt a strong obligation to defend his country and to fight fascism and to join the French Free Forces. But on the other hand, that would have meant leaving his parents, who were depending on him for support. So he had a choice between going to England to join the French Free Forces or staying near his mother and helping her to live. And the idea is the mother's really ill and depends heavily on the son. She's not going to survive if he goes. So he's got this obligation to his mother and this obligation to his country and to the larger service of justice and liberty. What does he do? Sartre ends up saying, I told him in the end he just has to decide. There's no theory that's going to tell him what to do. But anyway, this kind of consideration is very serious. Sometimes there are family obligations, promises, and so on one side, but then other very serious moral obligations on the other side. How do you assess that? It's related to the, stealing a sheep and the Euthyphro dilemma, but in this case, there's a little bit more to it than that. The parent hasn't committed an injustice. They simply need help. And on the other side, well, there are other very good things you could be doing. So how much do you let that take control of your life? It's a hard question. And a lot of people taking care of aging parents or other relatives who are, let's say, facing some kind of crisis or who suffer from some kind of disability face a similar dilemma. Here's another. The Infelicitous Oath. An agent swears to commit a crime and afterward is faced with the choice of either fulfilling the promise by committing the crime or not committing the crime and failing to fulfill the promise. So I promised to do something really wrong. I've got an image there from The Godfather. Yeah, maybe I've promised to go commit a murder or to go and rob a bank or do something terrible. Typically the examples are about breaking the law. In fact, this is a dilemma that comes from Gratian, a 12th century legal theorist. So this kind of thing, this kind of dilemma can come up in the law all the time. Somebody's made a promise, they've entered into a contract, and they now realize, wait, I promised to do something really immoral. Maybe they knew that at the time and now they regret it, or maybe they don't regret it, but maybe they didn't even realize it at the time. And the consequences of this, and not just the consequences, but the actual moral character of this, wasn't obvious to them until they suddenly realized, wait, oh my gosh, that's what I promised to do? That's terrible. There are a number of these cases in Greek tragedy as well. Aristotle talks about one in the Philoctetes. And so this can be a situation where you realize, I didn't realize what I was signing up for. I thought I was agreeing to this, and it turns out now I'm agreeing to, not just I'm agreeing to something else. It's not like a deal that keeps getting renegotiated and getting worse and worse. It's like, wait, I didn't realize that was what was entailed by my promise. Hold on a second. I should not have made that promise. But now what do I do? If I don't do this thing that I now realize is a pretty terrible thing to do, I'm breaking my promise. Intuitively, we kind of want to say, well, it depends how bad this is, right? But that's something a moral theory should give us some direction about. Where do I draw that line? Where is it like, well, that makes me feel a little uncomfortable, but I promised to do it, so I better do it. When is that the reasonable outcome? And when is it like, but that's monstrous. I know I promised, but I can't do that. So somewhere a line has to be drawn between those two kinds of reaction. And it's not very clear where it's going to be drawn. Now Bentham says, well, I've got the tool. I've got the principle of utility. Do the calculation and see just how bad it is and whether it takes precedence over that broken promise and its consequences. But it is a hard question, and any moral theory ought to be able to help you out with it. Another kind of case, the murderous adulterer. The murderous adulterer. For behold, one man, while seeking the friendships of the world, binds himself by oath to another, leading a similar life, to conceal his secrets with perfect silence. But he to whom the oath has been sworn is discovered also to be guilty of adultery, so as even to endeavor to kill the husband of the adulteress. This is from a marvelous, but little read these days, book by Gregory the Great, Moralia in Job. What's going on here is that I promised to keep a secret, right? I'm your friend, I'm seeking to become a better friend, and you say, yeah, I appreciate that. Can I confide in you? You say, yeah, absolutely. Really, it's serious. I mean, will you keep a secret? Okay, sure, I'll keep your secret. And the friend says, I've been having an affair with so-and-so's wife. We've been sneaking around. He doesn't know. But, this has been going on for a while. I'm serious about it. I'm really in love with her. You think, oh, man. Okay, I wish you hadn't told me this. Now I've got a burden to bear, right? I mean, that guy's a friend of mine too. I think this is not good. But anyway, he says, well, listen, I wouldn't tell you this, but I've decided I really want to spend the rest of my life with her. And she can't get out of that marriage. He won't grant a divorce. And in fact, if she even asks for one, he's going to kill her. He's not a nice man. So I'm going to kill him. But he can't tell anybody. This is an important secret. What do you do? Okay, Gregory the Great is saying, well, in this case, what do? You've promised to keep a secret. But it went from something bad, I'm committing adultery, to now I'm going to kill her husband. And now you're thinking, okay, the adultery, I was worried about that one. Can I really keep that secret? Should I? But now and you're going to murder the guy? And Gregory saying, look, there are serious moral considerations on both sides here. Presumably, there are infractions, secrets, that you wouldn't divulge because of that promise. If he had said, can I tell you a secret? I was a little late in coming to meet you, so I went 5 miles over the speed limit. Well, call the cops, Ma Barker? I mean, you're going to say, sorry, I can't keep that secret. I mean, look, there are certain kinds of secrets which surely say, all right, that probably wasn't good, but okay, fine. Others, presumably, but how, again, do we draw that distinction? How do we draw the line? So it's one thing to say, well, look, as common sense would, maybe sometimes you should break that promise to keep a secret and no longer maintain confidentiality. Maybe sometimes you shouldn't. But it's a serious question. And by the way, it's becoming a kind of widespread question in our society, not just in the context of friendships, as Gregory had in mind here, but in a broader sense. Often in business, people will sign NDAs. They're called non-disclosure agreements. They are brought in to consult with the business, but they sign this to say, look, you can't take what you're going to find out here as our consultant and go spread it around to our competitors. You can't just take our secrets and decide you're going to start your own company using those secrets, and so on. And it seems like that's an important tool of business. Now, sometimes you might think, but oh my gosh, could I make a lot of money? And actually, I don't trust these guys to develop this idea all that well. I think I could develop it a lot better. So it's not just me that's going to be benefiting. The world's going to benefit if I take and steal this idea and break my agreement. Should I do it? That kind of thing arises. Or the same thing happens in government. People leak things to the press all the time. And they sign promises that they will not leak. They can lose their jobs for leaking, but they rarely do. And so if you've got the occasional leak, somebody may say, this is so important, the public needs to know. And sometimes they do. However, and we call that person a whistleblower and not a leaker. But other times, we look and we say, no, that was to your advantage. The public didn't need to know that. Actually, you just were trying to gain some benefit from it. And so, once again, we face this problem. How do we draw that line? So it's not just a rare, oh yeah, okay, way back hundreds and hundreds of years ago, somebody thought up this problem. It's something that arises almost daily in the news. A different kind of example, the adultery dilemma. This isn't about what to do about a secret, but actually the act itself. Aristotle thought adultery was just obviously and always wrong. But this is raising a dilemma about it. Suppose a woman, and this is from Augustine in his book on lying, so it's a religious example, but there are plenty of examples outside that context. Suppose a woman casts her eye upon a Catholic Joseph and promises him that she'll betray their hidden retreats if she obtains from him that he lie with her. Okay, I've got to explain the background here. The idea here is these Christians are being persecuted, and this rather untrustworthy woman finds out where they've been meeting and where they've been hiding, and goes up to this guy she really likes, who's one of these Christians, and says, listen, sweetie, how would you like to sleep with me? And he says, no, I can't do that. And for various reasons, maybe I'm a married guy, maybe I've taken this religious vow. No, I can't do it. And she says, unless you do, I'm going to tell the authorities where you guys are. You're all going to be persecuted and killed. Not just you, but the whole bunch of you. Well, what does he do? Maybe he is married. Maybe she's married. Nevertheless, he realizes there can be terrible consequences of this. And there are cases like this in the Old Testament which really happen, where somebody is, in fact, the actual Joseph, right, in the story, where the Pharaoh's wife comes and tries to demand sexual favors from Joseph. And so what happens then? There can be terrible consequences, not only for the person, but more broadly for a whole group of people if he or she doesn't comply to such a request. In fact, the image I've got here on the slide for this is from a marvelous movie, The Lives of Others, where we've got this couple here kissing in the hallway, but she is having an affair with a high official in the East German government. Now, why is she doing it? Not because she wants to, not because she wants to cheat at all, but because that official threatens to destroy her career and that of her lover here, a playwright, and guarantee that neither of them will ever work again unless she submits to his sexual demands. And so she does, but she feels horrible about it. She doesn't do it because she wants to. She does it because she says the consequences of not doing it are going to be so terrible for me and for him and for lots of other people around us. And so that is a sort of situation where people are in effect facing sexual harassment and end up thinking, look, that's terrible, but that person can bring about terrible consequences for me if I say no. So sometimes what to do about that is really a very difficult dilemma, and somebody's put in a horrible position. It's part of the reason we think, look, somebody making those demands, making those threats, harassing in that way, is doing something terrible. Not only are they committing an injustice and doing something wrong in themselves, but they're putting somebody else in a situation where they basically are facing a moral dilemma now and may end up hurting other people as well in doing something immoral. So it's almost doubly immoral. A different kind of case, happier kind of case, I hope, the Simony Dilemma. Here I've got pictured a TV show, Suits, that was built on this whole idea. And again, from Gregory the Great. Imagine someone who's gotten their position illegitimately, by bribery or false credentials, lying, inappropriate influence, in the case of the TV show, by claiming to have a law degree he doesn't have, but does a very good job on which many other people rely. So Mike Ross in the show is somebody who does not have a Harvard degree. In fact, he doesn't really even have a college degree. He's kind of a guy who knows about the law, partly because he has a phenomenal mind and a photographic memory, but partly because he has a criminal background, and so he had lots of encounters and lots of reasons to learn the law. And Harvey there, who hires him knowing that he doesn't have any degrees, and in particular that this whole thing then has to be based on a lie. He's not admitted to the bar, none of that, but nevertheless, he's a phenomenally good lawyer. He's a great lawyer. And so he brings him into the firm, and all sorts of people rely on him. He's a star in the firm. But he has gotten the position on the basis of a lie. And well, eventually the lie is found out, and he goes to prison for one of the seasons, and then he leaves the show, tragically, because without him, there's no reason for the show to exist. But anyway, whatever you think about that, the key thing is, look, what happens, not initially. It's like, let's say, okay, it's wrong to have lied to have gotten the job. But here you are, right? You did. You bribed somebody, you lied, you presented false credentials, something bad happened to get you this job. But now that you're in it, you're really good at it, and other people are relying on you to perform it so well. The other people brought in to replace you, even though they do have the right credentials and so on, are not going to do it as well. So now there's a real dilemma here. You think, look, I've been dishonest. I should really confess and admit to people, I got this job inappropriately. I'm not a member of the bar. I don't have a law degree, and so on. But then a lot of terrible things happen. Then the law firm suffers. All of your clients suffer. You suffer. Your family suffers. And you might think, well, wait, now it looks like just nothing but badness goes down on that route. I'm doing great benefits here. I'm doing great things. In fact, in Gregory's original example, it's a priest, and it's a fantastic priest. And yeah, he lied to get the job as a priest or bribed someone, but it turns out he's phenomenally good and his flock depends on him. But of course, that can happen in all sorts of settings. It might be a great lawyer or a great professor or a great, I don't know, plumber who doesn't actually, never went through the apprenticeship and so on and so forth, and really doesn't have union certification, etc. So there can be all sorts of cases like this where, look, that person lied to get the job, but they're awesome at doing their job. What do you do then? A different kind of case, and the last case I'll toss out here, the worldly superior dilemma, also from Gregory. What happens here is you submit yourself to a leader, and you think that leader is somebody you can trust. You think that leader is going to do a good job. But then, well, maybe you didn't carefully inquire, as Gregory thinks, or maybe it's just that you turned out to be wrong. All the early indications were good, and then it turns out, oh, boy, did I make a mistake. So that ruler ends up doing terrible things. And so you've promised obedience to that ruler, but then that ruler is forbidding things that should not be forbidden, is commanding things that should not be commanded, and now what? You've submitted yourself to their authority. You've promised to follow their direction, to do what they do. But now they want to do terrible things. So the image there is of Mussolini and Hitler. And you can imagine lots of people who would have supported Mussolini or supported Hitler in the early days. Very large numbers of people did. And later, when they saw what actually these people were doing, became horrified and said, wait, I voted for that guy? Or in the case of Mussolini, nobody voted, but you might say, I supported that guy? Mussolini himself probably ended up feeling that way. He didn't start out seeking an alliance with Hitler. He started out seeking an alliance with Britain and France. And when they rebuffed him because of the invasion of Ethiopia, well, that is kind of a bad thing. And there's an interesting moral dilemma. It was actually strongly in Britain and France's interest to keep Italy on their side. But instead, they got so angry and they said, but we can't promote injustice, and this guy's just invaded Ethiopia. We can't become his ally. And so, as a result, he ended up allying with Hitler. And I'm sure some point came along when Mussolini said, oh, did I make a mistake? I made an alliance with the wrong person. I had no intention of doing any of this and getting involved in a world war and persecuting Jews and doing all the rest that now I've turned out to have to do. So in any case, that kind of thing can happen. You can ally yourself with the wrong person or become a subordinate, get hired by the wrong kind of boss. And all of a sudden, I mean, it might be a question of that boss giving you a command that you think I should not follow. But it can also be just now I'm in a position where I'm actually trapped. Look, I can't not do this. The person who agrees to follow Hitler or Stalin, let's say, and suddenly finds out, look, I have to do this or I'm going to be killed. And I now have to put in a position where I have to face these horrible dilemmas where there are no good outcomes. What do you do in cases like that? You can be put in terrible moral dilemmas because you are now subject by your promise, but also often by real force and real threats to do, well, terrible, terrible things to other people. All of those are serious moral dilemmas. I've dug some of them out of the medieval literature here, not just because I think they're interesting from a philosophical and moral point of view, but also because I think they really are deep dilemmas that are reflected all the time in history, in everyday life, in politics, in government, in business. These are things that we face constantly. So any moral theory better be able to help us with them.